Welcome! BWA Group, in association with the GetGrowing Hunt Club team, as well as the Hunt Club Community Association, is very proud to present The Secret Life of Soil, a presentation by Renée-Claude Goulet, a science advisor with the Canada Agricultural and Food Museum. The presentation will be about 40 minutes. The chat section has been disabled, but if you have questions, you'll be able to use the question and answer section. And without further ado, we'll begin.
All right, well, hello everybody. I'm seeing some people are still trickling in, but let's get going, and this is recorded so people will be able to review. So thank you for signing up. I really am excited to be here with you and to present some of the accumulated knowledge on soil health from about 5 or 6 years of working on the topic at the Agriculture Museum. One of our big files is actually talking about soil, something that we don't often think of as being that important in our lives. But as gardeners, farmers, it's really something that it's a big topic. It's something that there's a lot to know about, and it's something that's really hidden. So we're going to dig a little bit into the secret life of soil, and hopefully by the end you'll have a couple tips that you can apply in your own garden or farming. I'm not sure what everybody's background is here. I know we have people from all over Canada, so that's really exciting. So the goal with this is to give you some practical advice, and so that you come out knowing a little bit more about this hidden world under our feet. So I'm going to get my presentation started. Just bear with me for 1 second. Here we go. So you should now see my my screen. So thumbs up, we're good here. Okay. Perfect. So I've got my contact information here on Twitter. I'm at RC Goulet. I've got my email address here as well for anybody who might have any questions after the webinar. I'd love to answer them. So that's there for you guys. So this year is actually the International Year of Plant Health. So this year we're basically celebrating all the things that go into making plants healthy, and that includes healthy soil. We can't talk about plant health without talking about what lives in the soil and about soil properties and structure and texture and all these wonderful things. We're also in the International Decade of Soils right now. So this is the 10 years where we really celebrate soils. We have conversations at government levels to try to save this diminishing resource. So soil is actually a natural resource, just like forests, just like water, and we should be treating it that way, that is sustainably. And our presentation today, it fits in the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN. So they have a set of 17 goals that basically help orient anybody who wants to participate in making the world better through things like fighting hunger, encouraging responsible consumption and production, and also encouraging life on land. So with this webinar, we're hitting all of those marks. All right, so I'm gonna, oops. Okay, so why is soil important? What is healthy soil? How important is soil life in our garden? And gardening tips for better soil health. That's what we're going to be covering today. On the right here, I took a picture close up of my garden soil, and you can see it's actually not made up of much soil. There's a lot of leaves, there's some sprouts, there's some branches, there's all kinds of things going on, and that's a good thing. So we're going to learn why. So soil has a lot of functions. So we often think of soil as dirt, as something that we grow our food on, that we step on. But it's actually really important for our planet, for our well-being as humans. It filters and stores water, which is really important. Without soil, our water would stay pretty dirty. And it also stores carbon and plays a part in climate regulation. So soil actually will store CO2 from the atmosphere. So it's a huge tool in fighting climate change. And it's also the base of ecosystem productivity. So soil does all these things. It's pretty complex the ways it does it, but it can only do it when it is healthy. And today we're going to explore that question of what is healthy soil anyways. So healthy soil, it has a balance of physical, chemical, and biological properties. So those are three very important things we need to consider when we're working with our soil, when we're thinking of improving our soil, improving the planet and sustainability. It's not just one thing, it's really the intersection of these three big circles of science, basically. So we're going to start by looking at the physical properties of our soil, and that means that a healthy soil would have right proportion of components and also a good structure. Very important here. So what is texture? Well, when we're talking about texture, it's the makeup in sand, silt, and clay. There's three different sizes of particles that make up soil, and each one has specific properties. Okay, so our sand here is bigger. It contributes to the drainage of our soil. Silt is known as being what is really nutritious in our soil. It provides nutrients, and it also kind of creates mud, so it's a lot smaller. And then finally, we have our clay. Our clay is more like little paper sheets almost. It's very lamellar, and that is known really for holding water. So clay is really what absorbs water and keeps our soil moist when it's really dry. So all across Canada, we have different soil types. It's not the same soil everywhere. You'll have different proportions of these components. And in soil science, there is this classic triangle here that you can use to determine what type of soil you have. Now, perfect garden soil in the perfect world, which is rare, we have loam. So a loam is made up of 40% sand, 40% silt, and 20% clay. Okay, so a loam will have these components in different proportions. And I'll just show you here how you use the triangle. So you would go from your 40 here down this line, 20 down this line, and 40 here. So 40% sand, sorry, not salt. We don't want salt in our soil. 20% clay and 40% silt. That brings us right in the middle of loam here. So good water drainage and air infiltration like sand is what loam has. And then it also holds moisture well and is fertile like silt and clay. It brings together all of the best properties of these different mineral particles. There's an easy test you can do at home to see what kind of soil you may have in your garden. It's a jar test. So you would put a little bit of soil, about 1/3 of your jar would be soil from your garden, and then 2/3 water. You shake it vigorously, and then you just leave it on the table or on the counter overnight, maybe less long, it depends on the composition. But you leave it there, and the mineral particles will start to precipitate. They'll come out of the water one layer at a time. The heaviest layer first, the second heaviest, and the third. So your third layer to precipitate is your clay. The second layer is the silt, and the first one was sand. So by looking at your jar and the different size of the layers, you can kind of determine what type of soil you have. Now, your soil type is really important in your plant's success. Your soils will have different properties based on this, and the different tips I'm giving today will have maybe different ways of applying them depending on where you are. If you're in a heavy clay soil, some of the things I might say today might not apply so well as though if you were in a sandy soil. So we're going to keep going and look at the structure. So we've talked about the little mineral particles, but all the particles in our soil aren't individual. They're actually in clumps. And we really want our soil to be clumpy. So often people will dig around in their soil to break up all the clumps. But we really want those clumps because they help the water absorb into the soil. They help air absorb into the soil, both things that roots need in order to get nutrients from the soil into the plant. And the structure of the soil is really influenced by what is living in the soil. And we'll come back to that in a bit. But soil structure is really one of the big the big factors that makes our soil function properly, absorb water, clean water, grow food versus not. So if your soil is really powdery and brittle and doesn't have many chunks in it, it won't work quite as well as if it had good structure. It has a good balance of chemical properties. So we looked at the physical, which is the mineral part of the soil, but the soil is a chemical place. It's a living, it's very dynamic. There's changes all the time. And by chemical here, we're talking about the pH, so the acidity or the basicness of the soil, and the nutrient composition. Because yes, we have mineral particles, they each kind of hang on to plant nutrients and are released to the plant as needed, but that is affected by the pH. So we're just gonna look at here, what do plants need in terms of nutrients? Well, the main ones, there are 3 major nutrients that plants need. The first one being nitrogen, and the second one phosphorus and potassium. Nitrogen is actually in the air all around us. It's the most abundant element in the air. And there's microbes in the soil that are actually able to take that nitrogen from the air and convert it so the plants can use it. But when our soil doesn't have much of that bacteria, we might need to use more fertilizer, so more nitrogen fertilizer, which will give us a strong leaf growth and a dark green color. So nitrogen really makes your plants grow bushy. They get that nice green growth. Your phosphorus is for roots and early plant growth. When you're transplanting your plants in your garden, let's say you're transplanting tomatoes, phosphorus is what's going to help the roots establish and help minimize transplant shock. It'll also be a huge contributor to seed formation or fruit formation. So if you're growing tomatoes, if your tomatoes have an excess of nitrogen, they'll just grow big and bushy, but not make many fruit. So you'll need a lot of phosphorus for your tomatoes to really focus on creating nice, big, juicy fruit and seed development. Potassium is the third element that they need the most of: plant vigor, disease and stress resistance, flavor, color enhancement. And that's all like the qualitative aspects of our vegetables. So those are the 3 major ones. They're usually listed on fertilizer bags in that specific order. So when you see like fertilizer that has like 10, 10, 10, that means that 10% of the weight is nitrogen, 10% is phosphorus, and 10% is potassium. So we'll come back to fertilizer later, but these are the main things. And then there's other things. So as humans, it's kind of similar. We need some micro elements in our diet. So there's 3 secondary nutrients that plants will need: is calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, and 7 micronutrients. So those, that means in much, much, much smaller quantities, but they're still required by the plant for just its physiological process, just for functioning. So we're looking at boron, chlorine, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and zinc. So those are all elements in the periodic table. They're not necessarily in their free form. They're usually bound to our soil, our mineral particles. Okay, so that's when pH comes in. pH, you might know it as, you know, the pH of our water is 7, it's neutral. pH that is acidic would be something like a lemon or vinegar. Something that has a high pH would be like bleach, for example. So what this represents basically is the amount of hydrogen there is in the solution. So it's pretty high level scientific. We're going to stay to like the application of it. So pH will affect the availability of your nutrients in your soil. And it will either hang on to the nutrients or let them go. And when we're gardening, for agricultural soils and for gardening, it's recommended that we have a pH between 6 and 7.5. And I've brought up this box here to show you. It's because once you get past your 7 here, you can see micronutrients are becoming way less available. That means your plant doesn't have access to them because they're like stuck onto the soil particles. So If you have a pH around 6.57, which is typical for soils, unless you're living in a place that has a lot of conifers and a lot of pine needles on the ground, you'll have a more acidic soil in that case, but most soils are about already the right pH. But yeah, so you can see here, the ideal is in the between 6.5 and 7. You can do some home tests for that. I actually have a test kit here. I'm not sure if you guys can see, but I have a test kit. This is a big sciencey one, but there's some simpler ones that exist that you can take a sample of your soil and look at the pH. If you're way out of that range, there's products you can use, aluminum sulfate or sulfur to lower your pH, or limestone to raise it. It's for blueberries, for certain flowers, you need a very acidic soil. So you wouldn't necessarily be able to grow blueberries very well in a neutral soil. So different plants have different preferences. Tomatoes can tolerate also a little bit more acidic, but it really varies from plant to plant, but generally rule of thumb, 6.5 to 7 is good. So finally, the last kind of portion that's really important in our soil health is the biological activity of our soil. We often think of soil as it's dead, there's not much going on. Maybe we think of the big bugs that we find in our soil, but there's a whole world hidden in there, and that will be the major part of this presentation. So in our soil, we want a large diversity of organisms, and we want a cycling of nutrients. So all of that living stuff in our soil is actually what makes the world go round. So they're the ones that are responsible for recycling nutrients, for feeding plants, for turning compost into new soil. So there's a lot going on in there, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So as I mentioned, the top layer of the soil, there doesn't seem to be much going on, but when we take a deeper look and we look with a microscope, we start to see how complex this is. You have your organisms that kind of live in your soil just temporarily, like grubs. Some of you might have found those in your garden, grubs and things like that, insect larvae. Then you have your insects and your worms and things like that. You've got your mammals. But if we zoom in even closer, we find all kinds of microscopic organisms and bacteria and fungi and protozoa, which are usually about single-celled organisms or very simple organisms that are microscopic. I'll show you a video later. But this is really, you've got all levels of the food chain in there, and you've got all types of living organisms in your soil. So plants, fungi, archaea, bacteria, animals, they're all in there. So we want to take care of them. If you think of a forest, nobody's going in and fertilizing the trees. Okay, so when we're gardening, it's useful to kind of think of a forest as kind of like, that's what we kind of want to recreate in our garden. You want to kind of take nature's already kind of perfect as it is. So you just want to employ nature to help you in your garden. And part of that is taking care of all our life underground. So who do you want to team up with in your garden? Well, I'm going to talk about 3 groups today. And those are kind of the low-hanging fruit. These are the ones that you can have an influence on. And so what's really interesting about plants is that they actually send a large portion of their sugar that they create through photosynthesis into the soil. So they always communicate with the living organisms that are in the soil, mostly the bacteria, by sending them signals. The products are called exudates. So they'll just kind of shoot out some little molecular messages that will either attract or repel some of our living organisms in our soil. They're always talking to each other and helping each other out and feeding each other. So by encouraging the biological activity in your soil, you can actually help your plants grow a lot better and reduce the amount of inputs you need to put in your soil. So we've got our little root nodules, we've got our root zone bacteria, and we have our mycorrhizal fungi. That's a really big word. We're gonna look through that. So Bacteria, they're the most numerous, they're the most numerous organism in the soil. And actually 80 to 90% of microorganisms in compost are bacteria. Their job is to take organic matter, so dead living stuff, and turn it into new plant nutrients. So they kind of break it apart and make it available in the soil for plants to take up. So everything is made of carbon, everything is made of nutrients. This needs to be broken down and returned to nature. So bacteria are really important in the soil for that. There's all kinds of jobs. We don't know anything about the bacteria in the soil, really. We know enough to know that we don't know much. That's where we are now in soil biology. Maybe 10 years ago, we thought we knew 10% of the types of bacteria that lived in the soil. But now with new genetic technologies, we're finding out that we maybe know 0.1%. We know more about the ocean and about space than we know about the bacteria that live in the soil. So it's kind of like an emerging area of study, which I find really interesting. So bacteria are really, really helpful. They're decomposing, they're making nutrients available again. But there's also other roles. Oh yes, I wanted to show this experiment you can do to see if you have a lot of bacterial activity in your soil. Not only bacteria, other organisms too. But if you bury something made of pure cotton, 100% cotton, because cotton is plant, and then you come back to it a couple weeks later, you can come back to it about 2 months later, dig it up and see what's left. In this case here, we buried undies. So the elastic parts is really the only thing that's left. Everything else was consumed by soil organisms. So that's just to demonstrate how they actually recycle any plant matter we put in there, and it doesn't take very long. So if your soil is nice and alive, your undies will be pretty much completely eaten. If there's not a lot of biological activity in your soil, they'll stay pretty intact. So the little root nodules, so this is another type of bacteria we find in the soil. It's called rhizobia. So what they do, they're naturally present in our soil, and they form associations with legume plants. So legume plants, we're talking here like soybeans, clover, peas, beans, alfalfa, like a lot of the hay that we feed to animals, like to cows, is actually legumes. So what happens here is the plant will send out little chemical signals into the soil, which the bacteria respond to, and then they're attracted to the roots, and they colonize the roots. So they make these little balls here on the roots. That's all full of bacteria in there. And those are actually the type of bacteria that can take the nitrogen out of the soil and make it available for the plant. So in this case here, it's a symbiosis. So what's happening is that our plant is feeding the bacteria sugar, and then our bacteria are feeding the plant nitrogen. So it's like a win-win. What's really useful is that when the plant dies, and if the root stays in the soil, the nitrogen that is stored inside these balls stays in the soil as well. So it's a natural way to replenish our soil with nitrogen for the years to come. So legumes are very important in agriculture and even in gardening. And finally, we have our nutrient miners. So those are the fungi I was telling you about. They're very, very, very important. There's different types of them. They're very important for trees and also our garden plants, but not all plants make associations with them. So these are fungi that team up with our plants to help them get nutrients that are much further away. So if you think of a root system, it's pretty finite. The plant can't reach anything that's further away or that isn't directly touching the root. But when you bring in this fungi, this mushroom into the mix, this mushroom is specifically lives in the soil, and again with the signals sent in from the roots, I guess you could call them mushroom seeds that are in the soil, or spores, will start to germinate and infect the plant root. But this is a good infection again, So they'll connect into the plant root, and the plant root is also going to feed it sugar. And in exchange, the mushroom is going to be able to burrow very, very deeply and bring some nutrients and water to the plant from far away. So these are really, really important for our plants. And sterilized soil, there's a reason that plants don't do so well in it, because we've killed off all of the microbes that actually team up with plants to help them grow. So it's really cool to think that plants are not just individual from the soil. They're really all working together, and they're designed to, or they've evolved over time to provide kind of services to each other. So by encouraging all of this soil biodiversity, by encouraging our decomposing bacteria, by encouraging our mycorrhizal fungi, by encouraging our nitrogen fixers, we can help our garden be healthy and provide for itself and be more like a forest in the sense that it's self-sustaining. So there's a couple of rules. I'm going to go through them quickly and then we'll come back. So minimize soil disturbance. A lot of us take out the tiller in the spring and start wreaking havoc on our soil. Don't do that. We have maximizing crop diversity. So having a lot of different types of plants in one plot of soil. Keeping the soil covered will really help. Adding compost or manure, and keeping living roots in the ground year round. So what's so wrong with tilling? Why is that bad for soil? So tilling is an age-old practice. We've been using this for thousands of years to prepare the soil for planting. There are definitely advantages to it. If you have heavy clay soil, it's almost required sometimes. Different soil types will respond differently to it. But the problem with tilling is that you're mixing up all of your soil layers and breaking apart all your little root holes, all the earthworm tunnels. Also, soil kind of has a way of organizing itself into layers. So if you're going in there and mixing it up, you kind of end up with a uniform texture that tends to crust, and you also end up with a hard pan at the bottom where the blades of the tiller don't actually get to. So one of the things that agriculture is moving towards in general, and gardeners as well, is the no-dig gardening. It seems like old knowledge that you have to turn your soil, but with more science and more research into soil and biology, we're finding that that is not required, and soil actually does better over time if it's not tilled. So the first year might be a little problematic, but as you take care of your soil and it improves, tilling won't be required anymore. We want to maximize our crop diversity. So again, these here are soybeans and this is flax. So this is an experimental setup, but there's research that is showing that when you combine a legume plant with another type of plant that isn't a legume, you need to have way less fertilizer and inputs. There's fewer pests. Things just go generally better. So that's also becoming more common in conventional agriculture. Farmers are beginning to intercrop, so plant one type of crop next to another and so on and so forth. So that's really encouraging. So with soybeans, they do form that symbiotic association. So they leave nitrogen in the soil and they also help feed the other plants. And our flax here they grow at different rates, I think. So they'll have different harvest times as well. So there's lots of research going on with that, and that's something you can do in your garden. The more root diversity, the more plant diversity, the more microbe diversity, because different plants group up with different microbes. We want to keep our soil covered. So what I mean by that is adding mulch. So this diagram will show you a little bit here. Mulch has a lot of benefits. There's a couple of drawbacks as well, but one of them is that it will add organic matter back to your soil. So by organic microbes feed on organic matter. So if you don't have organic matter, your microbes are all going to die. So it's important to keep adding organic matter. and nutrients just from decomposition of that mulch. It'll also prevent erosion. So when it's raining a lot and your soil's uncovered, your soil's all just going to leave with the rain. It's hard for it to stay put. It only has the roots of plants to help it stay put. But mulch will absorb the water faster and you won't have all the runoff, which means you also don't have nutrient runoff. One of the big problems of agriculture is adding nutrients and then it rains and then they all drain off. So mulch helps with that. And it feeds our soil organisms. It suppresses garden weeds. So weeds that are under the mulch will not emerge. And it reduces your need for watering because your sun isn't heating your soil directly, it's heating the mulch, and it keeps your soil temperature low and comfortable for organisms in the soil. They don't like to be in the sun, they don't like to be hot. Potential pitfalls, you might have a few more pests. So slugs really like to live in mulch. So that's something that me and my friends are experiencing in our garden this year. We're having a bit of slug issues, but we're trying different things. One thing that works really well is Vaseline around, or petroleum jelly around the base of plants. The slugs don't like to climb the plants now. Another thing is that you could be introducing weed seeds depending on the mulch you're using. And if it's too rich or too fresh, like if you're using fresh wood chips, it could end up tying up nitrogen because you've got your bacteria that will be so busy decomposing it that they won't be giving the nitrogen to the plants. So, but mulch has more benefits than drawbacks, I would say. So I'll just showing you an example here. This is the garden that I have with my friends. And in the fall, we just put all of the leaves into the garden. Instead of putting them in bags and putting them in the compost, we rake up and plop them in the garden. You can shred them before. We don't. What we normally end up doing in the spring is going and kicking around the leaves and spreading them around, undoing the leaf mats that may have created, because that can create water issues. But leaves are really good. You could do straw. You could do just a classic wood chip mulch. Grass clippings are also good. So any like dry material that you can use to cover your soil. And you can see right under here, that was in the spring. So that was our nice dark soil when we started kind of like planting in it. So also minimizing disturbance. You see we didn't combine the leaves into our garden. We just planted straight into it. We made little furrows, planted, covered, and put the leaves back on. That also helps for germination because it keeps your soil moist and reduces evaporation. So one thing you'll notice if you use leaves or vegetable matter for your mulch is you might start to notice little clumps of vegetation on your soil. And I was curious and I pulled on one. And it turns out that it's an earthworm burrow. So these big guys here, the European night crawlers, they live very deep in the ground, but they make these little doors, I guess, to their burrows to prevent water from coming in. But night crawlers also, if you go out in the evening, like just at dusk, you can see them emerging from their holes and bringing entire leaves into it. So they kind of grab onto it with their mouths and then back up and go back into their tunnel with the leaves. So what's actually happening with our mulch in our garden is that the critters that live in the soil are taking them in, and that's where they decompose. So all of our leaves, which are perfectly good compost vegetation, are becoming compost inside of our soil. So we're feeding our soil or feeding our organisms, and they're helping. And you can see all around, I don't know if you can see actually, there's little clumps. That's all earthworm poop. And so when the earthworms eat the leaves, they poop out compost. So it's really great to see it all happen. And right now there's basically no more leaves in our garden. They've all been eaten. So just a little bit more about earthworms here. So you've got your deep ones, you have the ones that live in the leaf litter, and then you have some that live kind of in the first couple inches. They all have different jobs. There's a lot of text on here, but some of them feed on soil, some of them feed on organic matter, some bring the organic matter way deep But all of those tunnels really help for giving air to roots, to giving water to our roots. And like I said, all of these tunnels here are lined with earthworm poop. So when our roots go towards them, they find nutrients right there. And we'll come back to the worms in a bit. But fertilizing is another aspect of our soil health. And often we tend to use mineral fertilizers. But when we fertilize, we should think of feeding the soil first. So as I mentioned earlier, organic matter, organic carbon is what our soil organisms are eating. So growing year to year in the same garden without fertilizing, your outcomes are going to be diminished over time. So you need to replenish your nutrients regardless. But definitely if you think of feeding it carbon-rich material, that's much better than just mineral nutrients. Okay, so organic amendments that contain organic matter and nutrients. So manure and compost are really, every year adding some of that is really going to benefit your soil. It's more of a long-term fertilizer, so you won't draw many benefits on the first year, but the second year it'll be all available and so on. You can have leaf mold, compost, yard city bagged. Vermicompost is a really, vermicompost is a really good one too, and that's something you can make at home and have kind of like an endless supply. You can put it in just your little planting holes. Bone and blood meal are also rich in nutrients and organic matter. You have to watch out though, because bone meal, one of them has a high nitrogen content and the other one a high phosphorus content. So depending on what you're doing, you have to watch out for which one you're adding. Fish emulsion, so this here, that's basically like fish byproducts, and you can mix that in with water and that'll give nutrients to your plants. My favorite to use is hen manure. It's concentrated, it's rich in nitrogen. You can see it, maybe you can see it, 532, that means it has 5% weight nitrogen, 3% weight phosphorus, 2% weight potassium. So it's a nitrogen-rich fertilizer that's good like early in the season. It packs a bigger punch, like it's a faster acting one than compost. So you want to use it sparingly. I would always recommend to do a nutrient test in the soil before adding any fertilizers, but that's not always doable. But just rule of thumb, just adding compost or some sort of organic matter and nutrient in the early season, so like in the spring, is a good idea. Your cow manure or sheep manure or your leaf compost, that's good to add in the fall, because here in Canada we get a good winter, so everything's going to be pretty inactive over winter, but come spring the nutrients will be available a little in a good quantity for your plants to grow. And then you can add a little bit more compost around the plants during the growing season to give them a boost. But that's usually what I do is in the fall. And again, I'll do a little bit of hen manure in the early growing season and then more compost later on. I think that's all I had to say for feeding the soil first. So vermicomposting, as I said, it's something you can do at home. What's really cool about fresh vermicompost and fresh compost that you make at home is that it's very biologically active. You have all of those organisms in there. You have those decomposing bacteria. You have protozoa, which are small little organisms, and it's kind of like putting a probiotic in your soil. You're like, I'm not sure that there's any research that shows that long-term these organisms stay in there, but it can help give a boost to your soil, either temporarily or to kind of help revive a more dead soil. So what's really cool about vermicompost and home compost and things like that is it's very alive. It's like it's like a witch brew of life. So it's really nice to add that to your soil. Sorry. So here's a little video of a protozoa that lives in a vermicompost. So I have a vermicomposter Oh, I hope it works. It might not work. So I had a little video of a little protozoa. This little guy here. This is under a microscope. So you can see it moving around and eating. They eat bacteria. So there's all kinds of living creatures that you can only see with a microscope. And once you start looking with a microscope in vermicompost juice, as I like to call it, you can see all kinds of things. I really wish this was working. Maybe I'll have to do it another way. So the last tip that I have for you is living roots year round. This might not seem very feasible, but here's an example of something that's, again, picking up steam in agriculture in Canada and the States, a little bit everywhere. It's cover crops. So cover crops are a secondary crop that you plant under your main plants that will help them. Whoops. So you can see here is clover planted with some wheat or barley. I'm not sure which one it is. But if you remember when I mentioned about clover is a legume, it has those associations with nitrogen fixing bacteria. So if you plant them with another crop, they'll help keep the soil moist. They'll help keep the soil well structured. They'll feed organisms. They'll leave some nutrients in the soil after they die. But there's so many benefits to keeping living roots in the soil, and they'll keep on feeding bacteria. There's studies that show that even when it's -40 outside, when we're all bundled up inside, there's still some biological activity underground, and microbes are still alive and they're still working. So if you have living roots in there, there'll be something for them to eat, to keep going. So in the spring, you still have a good population. Without living roots, then your soil is a little bit empty of food. Another thing you can do is just cut at the base of your plants instead of pulling them out. So in the spring, what we do, instead of uprooting everything, we just chop everything right at the bottom with pruners. And that way the leaves, the roots stay in there. And next, when we come back in the spring, they're still in there, but it decomposes over the summer. So the idea is always to try to add more into your soil than you take out. So this is a very round, very overview of the topic. There's so much you could say about soil, and there's so much to dig into. And I might have created more questions in your mind. That's why I have my information there, so you can send me an email if you have a burning question. But I will wrap it up here with a picture of our garden at the end of the summer. So it's a little bit packed. We tend to overplant, but that also means we don't have many weeds because they're crowded out by our plants. And so that's, we've been applying some of these soil health practices here for the last 5 years, and we have definitely seen our soil improve a lot. We have clay soil here. When we were first digging, there's shale rock. So it's been an adventure trying to get our soil up to par. But we did it, and now our soil is nice and workable. It's very rich. It retains water really well, which was not the case in the first years. So some of these might not be realistic for you, but some of them might be, and some might be things you want to try or have access to or not. But again, it's a lot of trial and error, and reading online too. There's so many resources now. So I hope that I've piqued your interest, and I'd like to open it up to questions.
Go ahead. Hello. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in, and then I'll read them so Renée-Claude can answer them. We have a question. How do you rank different fertilizers, for example, mushroom, cow, sheep, etc.?
Mm-hmm. So how do I rank them? So it depends on your goals again. So if you haven't been adding compost at all, I would say that adding something like cow, sheep, manure, they're low nutrient, but high in organic matter. So that's a good thing to add to boost your dead plant matter in your soil. But like I said, they're usually not very rich in nutrient. Their nutrients are released by the microbes in the soil over time. So I quite like using sheep manure. It just has worked well for me. It's a personal preference. I think at that point, it also contains micronutrients, so that's also good. All of them contain micronutrients, so that's good for your plants. I would say mostly on what's available. Price, because that's a factor for me. I would love to pay for a load of mushroom compost every year, but that's like $300 to get it, shipped. So to me, a lot of it is like ease of access, and it's easy to access sheep manure, so that's what I'll get. I also vermicompost, so I can use some of that. We used to compost here, but we stopped doing that just for practicality reasons. There are 3 of us sharing the garden, so it gets a little tricky. And then in terms of, so you might have noticed a lot of these are animal source manures. So if you're vegan and you don't want to use these, then city compost or just vegetable compost that you make at home would be fine. But animal manure, animal sourced compost contains a lot more organic matter and nutrients for the quantity of it. And it's a good way to reuse something that's being created anyways.
Then the next question, I'm not gonna, it's one of those words that when I read it, I know what it is, but trying to say it might come out funny. Regarding slug deterrence, diatomaceous, of course.
Yes. So I've tried it. We've actually tried it. It seems to work, and it works for more than just slugs, which is nice. But the only caveat is that you need to reapply it after it rains, whereas petroleum jelly, you don't. So it's again, time saver. Diatomaceous earth, I really like it for many reasons, especially if you're using it inside the house for ants and things like that. But diatomaceous earth, for those who don't know, it's basically, so in the water, we have diatoms, which are very, very, very small photosynthetic organisms. So they're like plants almost, but their outsides are made of silica, which is a very drying material, as we know. You know those little packets of silica gel you get in like a shoebox or something? It's that same material. And when those little things die, they accumulate in the ocean bottom. And so that's what diatomaceous powder is. They just harvest those dead diatoms, and their little shells are very sharp. So when bugs crawl through them, it gives them little micro cuts and it dehydrates them. So that's how it works. So it's like a physical pest control. I've also heard of beer traps for slugs, but I have not tried it.
Our next question. One of our guests has planter boxes filled with garden soil, big yellow bag, and she's wondering if worms should be added to the soil.
That's interesting. So you could, it wouldn't do any harm, but the problem might be that if there's nothing left for them to eat, like you'd almost need to feed them, and they might start eating your roots and things like that. I wouldn't say that worms would be necessary. Microbes are everywhere. So even though we think our soil doesn't have microbes, there's still stuff going on that we can't see. But yeah, you can add worms, but I don't think it'll make a very big difference in container gardens. Container gardens, often when we put garden soil, it's already very rich. It's already kind of like ideal soil. So it doesn't need much for sure.
Okay. The next question, I'll just read. If you have a backyard composter, how do you know that the dirt is ready to be moved from the compost container to the garden? i.e., is it okay to still see bits of food that haven't broken down yet? And what time of year is best to add it to the garden?
Okay, so really good question. Yeah, so for compost, different things decompose at different speeds. So your vegetables and fruit are going to decompose faster, but branches and pieces of things that are a little bit more carbon rich, so like, branches, weeds, things like that, they might take a little bit longer to decompose. Basically, when it looks like mulch, So that is, it's crumbly, but there might still be pieces of vegetation in it. It's ready. I wouldn't add it to the soil yet if it still has like pieces of carrot or, you know, apples or anything. That means it needs more time. So it needs to look a little bit like a black color. It can be mulchy, like it can be loose in big chunks, but you want to make sure that it's not hot anymore, because compost will also heat up. Again, the heat is a byproduct of the microbes acting. When the microbes are eating the organic matter, they produce heat. And so if your compost is still hot inside, that means the bacteria are still acting. There's no real danger to adding compost that's not ready yet, other than you might end up tying up nutrients in your garden if decomposition has to keep going once it's in the garden. So your microbes will be busy continuing that decomposition rather than working in the soil, and that will tie up nitrogen. And what I mean by that is that the microbes, nitrogen is part of microbes. Like they, just like we are, we have nitrogen that makes up part of us. So if there's a lot of microbes eating and they're very happy and they're reproducing, that's using up nitrogen from the soil. So that's how it tied up. It's not really that they hang on to it. It's just that nitrogen becomes them. So it's no longer available for the plant. So to answer the second part, the best time would be in the fall. And you can also sprinkle it around your plants in the summertime, but yeah, the best time would be in the fall. If it's not quite ready, it'll keep decomposing over winter and be good to go for the spring. I hope that helps.
Great. Next question. This one is actually local to Hunt Club.
Nice.
Oh, I see. I jumped ahead, didn't I? I'm going to go backwards. What about weeds? There's always going to be weeds. Do you recommend pulling them? And if you pull them, do you leave them to be broken down?
So, oh, that's a really good question. So weeds, yes. So we're selective about which weeds we actually do bother with. So grasses, we weed them because they spread and they make seeds. But things like purslane, so which is it's one that grows very close to the ground and it kind of spreads, and it's a chunky plant that we usually leave because that helps provide cover for our soil, and it helps with water retention, and it's actually edible too. I haven't tried it. But there's always going to be weeds, and it's up to you really how much you want to remove them. In theory, you could just leave them be, but then they produce seeds. So what I like to do is just to cut them at the base and leave the roots in the ground and leave the roots active for your microbes. And then you still have something that's holding on to the soil. It's a lot of work to go around and pick out every little thing. So sometimes it's just a matter of letting them grow and like, okay, now it's a big plant. It's about to go to seed. I'll cut it or I'll remove it now. But what I'm finding is that if we leave the purslane, it kind of prevents the other weeds from taking over. So we ended up with less weeding, and with the mulch also, there's a lot less weeds. Be careful though, don't use hay in your garden. Make sure that if you go for that, it's straw, because hay, again, it's grass and it contains a lot of seeds, and you might actually inoculate your garden with more weeds. So hay is the stuff that animals eat, whereas straw is their bedding. Straw is the leftover from like grains, whereas hay is really grasses specifically grown to feed animals. So yeah, and then when we pull them, we leave them on top of the soil, and then they just shrivel up. The worms come and grab them and bring them underground. When we leave them on the ground, there's never any the week after when we come back.
Great. And then the next question, in Hunt Club, we have a community garden, and just recently we had top dressing soil that was delivered. And the question is, how well does it need to be mixed into the soil that's there?
Not very much. You can just use a fork, like a pitchfork, and kind of fork it in rather than fully flipping your soil over. It's going to be less work, and whatever organisms are already in your soil are going to do some mixing naturally. Nutrients also leach. So any excess nutrients, or I won't say excess, but any nutrients that it contains will also leach through the ground and reach your plant roots anyway. So you don't need to really like till it in or anything. Just on the surface and like just kind of forking it in will be good enough. And then biology will take care of the rest.
Perfect, thank you. And the next, why would some plants such as dahlias and tomatoes grow so tall with little fruit or flower production?
So that would probably be excess nitrogen. So if they have an abundance of nitrogen, they will focus on some big, bushy, tall growth rather than fruit production. So that's definitely a common issue.
And next up, how do native versus non-native species influence the soil health?
Okay, that's very interesting. So often non-native species will establish without competitors, so they kind of take over, and that can be problematic. But for native species, typically they're probably more adapted to our soil types here, and I'm not sure that I have a specific answer for this question. It's always better to have native species because that's just where they belong, and they're adapted to here. When we have things like purple loosestrife, for example, they tend to run invasive because they're not really part of our ecosystem here. Our ecosystem doesn't really know how to deal with it. So I'm wondering, I don't know, I'd have to do a little bit more research, but I'm wondering if there's specific microbes in our soils here, if there's different interactions between native and non-native species. So that's a really excellent question. I'm sorry, I can't fully answer that.
Next question, what about leaving plant roots in the garden at the end of the season? Will that help the soil?
Absolutely. Yeah, it will. And they'll stay there and they'll decompose in the soil. And what's neat too is when they decompose, they'll leave the channels that their roots were in. So it'll help also with water absorption.
How can you feed your lawn so the chafer doesn't become a problem? Or should I say raccoons that dig them up and ruin the lawn?
Oh man, yeah. So those are common problem. You can apply some nematodes. They sell like special little nematodes that you can put onto your soil, and those guys will go and infect the chafers or grubs, as some other people call them, and kill them. So that's one strategy. So they're actually the larval form of Japanese beetles and June bugs and another type of bug. So they're only temporarily in your soil, which is the good news, but the adults can go and lay new eggs. So you can actually try to control the insects above ground to try to reduce how many of them set up in your lawn. But it is a common problem, and there's not much to be done other than maybe the nematodes.
And then next question, we should actually not be removing fine tree roots from our soil?
So from that, it depends on what kind of tree, because some trees can spread through rhizomes, so through their roots, and they'll pop up a new tree. Like for example, aspen is that type of tree, birch is that type as well. So depending on the type of tree you have, it might actually sprout a new tree. So you may want to remove them or not. I would tend to leave them if they're not harming anything.
And the last question for now, the soil has a pH of 7.42. Is it okay to add a bit of bone meal to some of it?
Yeah, that should be fine. I'm not sure that would reduce your pH much. 7.42 is still a perfectly workable pH. It should be fine. We just did a soil test last night, and our pH was also around there, and our tomatoes are doing really good. They're maybe not optimal, but they're still doing all right. So I don't know that your bone meal will actually reduce your pH, but you can add bone meal for nitrogen, or bone meal So I keep getting confused bone meal and blood. I think bone meal is high phosphorus. But yeah, you should be fine to add some of that to it.
Perfect. And we had a note that because earlier the organizers and we had talked about when you were burying the cotton underwear. If you're looking for a keyword search on it, you can search soil your undies as the test, and then you can see different people's results that have tried it to find out about how healthy their soil is. Is there any other links or resources that you would recommend that you still refer to?
I really like OMAFRA. So OMAFRA is the Ontario Ministry of Food and Rural Affairs, Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. Ooh, that's a big one. But they're basically like the government resource for farmers. So they have all kinds of really good resources, online resources for integrated pest management. So that is managing the pests in your garden without solely using chemicals. So ways to do it. They have growing guides for different crops. It's really a complete resource. As all government websites, it's not super accessible, but you can search for what you're looking for. It's a really complete place to look, and where I get a lot of my information, because it's based on science, it's been vetted. It's really good. And I also like a lot of American universities have extension services. So there's, if you look, I think it's Michigan State U Extension Services. Again, it's resources for farmers, for people who grow crops or market gardeners, things like that, which are really useful for home gardeners as well. So resources on the bugs and things like that, that's all there. Those are main ones that I use.
Okay, I think you got through all of our questions.
Awesome.
One more that popped up.
Oh, excellent. So just to give you some of the positive feedback that we have just gotten, we had a comment, awesome presentation and perfectly timed for our first ever community garden planting season. And another message from Barb Shea, who Be Will Group, Jason Dubé, Kat Gracie, we'd like to thank Barb Shea for helping coordinate, and we're so grateful for your time. It was a wonderful kickoff and additional resource for our little seed growing program this year. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm so happy that it was helpful to some of you. Again, feel free to reach out. Good luck with your late planting season. I'm sure it'll go well. It's never too late to plant. We plant year round. Or year round. I mean, we plant all summer long. We don't plant in winter.
So we'll close out and we'll say goodbye. And Vancouver Island is saying thanks as well. Ottawa Hung Club is saying thanks. Thank you for your time, Renée-Claude. Hopefully we can do another update as more information comes to light about the secret life of soil.
For sure. Nice to talk to you all.
Great. Thank you. Bye.